I think it's now clear that there are going to be three really big issues that dominate international security and world development over the next 30 or 40 years. One of these, without question, is the widening socioeconomic divisions. About 1 billion of the people, the worldwide population, are actually in the countries of the North very largely, or they are elites in the rest of the world. But the other 5 billion are really marginalised, but crucially, and this is the second point, they're much more aware of their own marginalisation. Huge improvements in literacy, in communication, mean that the majority of people know that they are no longer sharing properly and fairly and with justice in the goods of the world, so to speak. And it's that combination, what you might call a revolution of frustrated expectations, which is extremely dangerous. Then you come to the third point, that you have this socioeconomically divided world, which is actually facing environmental constraints. Now, you have the issues like conflict over oil and the rest, but the key one without question is climate change. Look at it this way, until about 15 years ago, the people who worked on climate change believed that most of the impact would be on countries of the temperate latitudes, Canada, Britain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Russia, for example. These were countries which were relatively wealthy, and the assumption was they would be able to cope. The changing in the understanding of climate science now is that it's recognised that the tropics are going to be massively affected, and affected in one particular way. That way is a change in the entire world distribution of rainfall away from the tropical land masses, both towards the oceans and to the polar regions. Now just think what that means. Worldwide, more than 4 billion of the world's people live in the tropics. Many are still subsistence farmers. Virtually are all dependent on the rich tropical croplands. If those progressively dry out, the human consequences are going to be absolutely immense. There will be far more poverty, more disruption within countries, and crucially, there will be far greater migratory pressures. It's thought that there may be somewhere between 30 and 40 million people who are actually displaced within or across national boundaries at present. Some of the estimates go to 300 to 400 million people displaced as a result of climate change. Just think what that means from the viewpoint of the North Atlantic countries, Fortress Europe, Fortress America and the rest. The whole tendency will be to close the castle gates, and that is going to lead to both radical movements, huge human suffering, and essentially an extremely unstable world. And we do tend in the West to see things in terms of maintaining control. What we have to do now is really quite a revolution in thinking, and this affects of all of us. It affects particularly, I think, an agency such as ActionAid. As far as climate change is concerned, you have to face up the fact that something's going to happen. So we have to look to actually trying to ensure that people can survive under drier climates. This is not going to be easy, and essentially we're going to also have to look at particular areas. It's the drying out which is the key. The coastlands are significant, rising sea levels, more intense tropical storms, very important, but essentially it's the drying of the land masses. Now, a group like ActionAid is very strong on issues of human rights and trying to help in processes of migration. It's not easy to advise on how more you do it. It's much more a question of people recognising this is going to be a very big issue, and the kind of expertise that ActionAid has is going to be crucially significant in facing much bigger challenges than the organisation faces at the present time. But beyond that, ActionAid has to be part of a much wider coalition which addresses at root the core problem of climate change. We're not talking about decreasing carbon emissions in countries like the United States or Britain by 10 or 15% over 15 years. We've got to go for something like 60% decreases over a 20-year period at the very most. And that requires a revolution, and you're going to require very strong voices. The Greenpeaces, the various groups in Britain and elsewhere, and in particular the strong global development movements like ActionAid. In one sense, I'm actually cautiously optimistic. I think we face some huge problems, and we face the potential of a very dangerous, very unstable world. But at the same time, that recognition is now growing, and we therefore have an extraordinary opportunity over the next 5 years to actually change the way we think about things and work much more for a sustainable world, which is rooted in emancipation and justice. If we can do that, then it's possible this next decade or so could be crucially important in actually ensuring a safer, more peaceful world for much of the rest of this century. I think what we have to face is that one of the core problems over the next 30 years is going to be climate change, and with the probability, almost the certainty of a progressive drying out of the tropical land masses, the impacts are going to be absolutely huge in terms of people suffering, in terms of instability, in terms of increases in conflict, and particularly in terms of migration. Now, for an organisation like ActionAid, it could help in all kinds of ways. One, obviously, is trying to make it easier for people to live under drier conditions. Two, having to address the huge problems of massively increased migration, an area in which ActionAid has a great deal of expertise. If we're dealing with hundreds of millions of people wanting to move, this raises huge issues of human rights. It raises issues of the nature of citizenship in terms of global, in terms of state and other citizenships. It really requires a rethink of how we're going about things. For climate change, I think we have a fundamental problem, and ActionAid, while it can do a tremendous amount to ameliorate the effect, also has a very powerful role to play in concert with many other organisations in convincing the key polluting countries of the need for quite radical cuts in carbon emissions. If we can combine that kind of action with ameliorating the impact in southern countries, then we have the real prospect of actually moving to a period of relative peace. If not, we're in for a very, very dangerous century.